Hi friends, I am going to make sure that I have my screens set up. So hang tight for just another moment. We will get started. Trying to make sure I can see the chat. Pop out chat. Hi Aria, hi Scotch Queen. All right, cool. And I think we are set. Awesome. Good morning, guys. Those of you who it is morning for, it is morning for me. Earlier than I usually do these. Yeah, hey Joe. I actually do not dwell with mornings. It's 11 a.m. here, but I wanted to do it a little earlier this time so that those of you who couldn't join due to time zones could hopefully join and be able to say hey now. Tell me a story about your cat. Story about my cat is that she is currently purring her face off in the lap of my companion animal over to my right, and she is very content, very very content. And that is the story about Jane. Another story about Jane is that she was named after the Bob Dylan song Queen Jane, so we also call her the Queen, which she obviously is. I will be right back. I'm going to shut the door to this room so I do minimum bothering. Oh, wait, no, Jane's coming to my lap. Companion animal will shut the door. Look at that. Everyone wins. My baby girl. She knew it was time for the live stream and she's like, no, I need to be in the frame. um, so if this is your first time joining one of these, this is our third Nature League live stream, and really it's just yes, hello cat. Really, it's just a way for us to maintain our sense of community, think a little bit about life on Earth while we are kind of contemplating our own species' life on Earth, etc. And yeah, just a little bit of gathering time. On the last stream, hi baby girl. I know, hi, I love you too. On the last stream, I read a little bit from Aldo Leopold, who is considered the father of wildlife management for the United States. Was an amazing man, and I'll probably read a little bit of that later on. Hello from Alberta. Hey there. Hello. Yeah. Hopefully this time works for people. And if you want to share this link around, definitely feel free. I think it's open to the public, so if you have friends that you know are bored at home or people that are into this, certainly ask them to join if they would like. So I had a thought for kind of the main topic I wanted to chat about today, but first, treating it almost like this is a classroom. So every fall I get to teach a class called Wildlife and People, and it's a gen ed credit. So it's just anyone can take it. Satisfies a natural science credit for undergraduates, and we talk about just everything. But I like to start off each day. Hi there, hi from Spain. We are wishing you the best. Stay safe. Everyone, stay safe. Please do take care of each other. I know that it's stressful right now. Hopefully this helps us out a little bit just by being able to gather online. So a lot of times I would start my class by going to a site called sciencedaily.com. And this lets me just kind of check in on the daily news, except instead of it being news headlines about, people and events and things like that, it's news headlines about science that's just been published. So I'm going to sciencedaily.com, and then I'm going to click on the plants and animals topic tab, and I'm going to copy and paste this into our chat right here so that you guys can follow along if you'd like. So I haven't looked at this yet this morning, but this just kind of lets you see kind of the way that I like to do a warm-up, if you will. So the top headlines for today, April 5th, 2020, for plants and animals. The first one we have, straight up, we have something about trial drugs for early stages of COVID-19. Looks like this is an engineered human tissues. So that's kind of interesting. One of the ways that we have learned a lot about humans, amazingly enough, is from model organisms, or basically from non-humans. All right, bye Jane. See you again soon. I know you're coming back. Don't even kid yourself. So that would be things like mice models, or even fruit flies. So these species that on the outside might not seem very, very similar to us, but when we're studying very basic things about the body, or about cells, they wind up really helping. And so a lot of the times when we have something we care about that's hurting humans, so think about human cancer, or right now COVID-19, we usually get a lot of research that comes out of non-human animal models. And that's a tricky topic because while things can be really promising, it's not humans. It's a different system. So the fact that this trial drug that they're showing in this headline is in engineered human tissues is really interesting, because it means that it's not just that something has some evidence for a good response, but that it's actually in human cell lines, which is good. So this one is cool. I don't know if anybody saw this headline. The traces of ancient rainforest in Antarctica point to a warmer prehistoric world. So yeah, scientists found evidence for rainforests near the South Pole about 90 million years ago. 90 million years ago is not that long ago. That's pretty wild, right? That's so wild. So cool. Eve, you stay awesome too. And I'm seeing on the side here, which is pretty neat, talking about the missing link in the coronavirus jump. And this was from about a week ago. But you know, scientists are working around the clock, like so many other professions, to learn about this thing that's affecting our world. And so two recent studies of the virus's genome. So basically they grabbed the virus, so the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 technically, and they looked at its genome. And the genome, remember, is the entire set of DNA. So DNA is made up of those nucleotides, so A's, T's, G's, and C's. And imagine you have a full stretch of DNA and it's just those letters. And when you have a chunk of those letters that does something or is functional in some way, that's what we call a gene. But a genome is just that entire stretch of letters. So these two recent studies looked at the genome, so that entire stretch of genetic information in this virus, and it looks like reached controversial conclusions. This was published by the American Chemical Society, so it should be a credible source. They found first that snakes are intermediate hosts of the new virus. And second, that one of the proteins in this coronavirus has some similarities with an HIV protein. And interestingly, a study now says actually those are both incorrect, both of those recent studies, and instead pangolins are the missing link for this transmission between humans and bats. So, a couple of things to break down here. First of all, the fact that science, remember, is a process of ruling things out. Okay, so we're trying to get closer to that truth. And so as we go, there are going to be things that we get wrong. Scientists are going to get things wrong. And so it's the job of other scientists to check in on those results. That's why being able to replicate results in science is so important. So these scientists are saying, you know, those things you found about snakes and similarities with HIV proteins, we're not sure that either of those are true. We should actually be looking at pangolins. So this is a bummer because pangolins are one of my favorite species. They're so weird and I love them because they are so strange. Um, so we may as well check in on this. And just so you know, the way that they ruled out the idea of snakes, they found an error in that analysis that came up with snakes as the intermediate host. Um, and so they just they found error. They cross checked with each other. Um, let me see. Is the stream still going? There's no one talking, which is totally fine. I just want to make sure that everything's all right. If people are just listening and thinking, that's lovely, but I want to make sure we're not frozen. Cool. Excellent. Lovely. Thanks, guys. Just want to make sure. So as they're checking it out, they're thinking, okay, no, we think maybe it's pangolins. And remember, in part of this headline, they're talking about intermediate hosts. Yay, T. Intermediate host, because this is a virus that is going between different species. Like so many diseases that humans can get, both viral and bacterial, typically other species get them as well. Understanding where a certain new virus, like this new coronavirus, because coronavirus, that group of viruses have been around, but this is a new strain, where it came from is of importance. And so it looks like definitely in bats, but the question is, how did it jump from bats over to humans? And there's been some speculation, but this article is saying it's looking like pangolins, which some have been saying for quite a while. But again, it's a matter of double checking. So you guys, pangolins are so damn cool. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the red list. The red list site for pangolins, so that we can just check in on this incredible species for a second, especially if you don't know about it, though I know most of you nature leaders are all about knowing some of these really fascinating creatures. And there's multiple species, by the way. There's a ton of species of them. I'm just going to grab the Sunda pangolin, and I'm going to send this link into the chat, and we can check out the pangolin real quick. So first of all, if you see them, they are like scaly mammals. It's very, very wild. They are, a lot of them are found in Southeast Asia. Like I said, there are multiple species, so some of the range will be a little bit different. The one that I just linked you to, the Sunda pangolin, is critically endangered. So this is a species that is very close to being extinct. One of those reasons, yeah, I know, Joe, exactly. So this is how this gets really tricky, right? The reason why something like viral transmission can directly affect conservation is because exactly what you're saying. If you start thinking of a species as a pest species, so for example, let's say rats, right? Rats back in the day, Europe and so many other places, but let's say like Europe and during the plague, the idea of rats transmitting something, you know, that kind of reputation as this is a species that passes disease can matter for conservation. It can matter so much when we start having these negative feels and thoughts towards certain species that can wind up affecting their long-term survival. So I agree, Joe. That's a really big concern here. Is that just because we see that pangolins were able to be a part of this link, a part of this chain, a link in the chain, that doesn't just mean that we then say this is a species that is a pest species and, you know, screw pangolins, because it's just so much more complicated than that. Let me see. I'm checking in. Rose, snakes can salmonella. Mammal to mammal makes sense to me, like penguins. Sure. Yeah, Joe, that's fabulous. Yeah. Actually, bird to human is a huge thing. Birds carry so many diseases, like an incredible amount of diseases. And humans can catch quite a lot of them. Imagine like the bird flu, some of these other, even I think things within the coronavirus family, transmittable by bird. Salmonella is another good one, though that's, bacterial versus viral can be different. Indeed, yes, feathery dinosaurs, indeed. So the avian dinosaurs. Yeah, so you can also think about whether a virus will affect, different orders, as Joe was saying, like jumping order to order. So in terms of taxonomy, like we how we group and define different species, you can have something as different as a snake and a human be able to both have something, because if you think back, if you go back far enough in geological time, we do have a common ancestor. Like snakes and humans are closer to each other than, say, fish and humans, right? Which are closer to each other than, say, sponges and humans. So if you go back far enough, there are enough similarities to where that virus can utilize our cells. Another thing to keep in mind, though, Rose, is that, and just so you guys know, I'm just saying the name that I see on the screen. If your name is something different and that's just a screen name, I apologize. I'm just reading off of there. So feel free to let me know if you go by something different. But Rose here, another thing to keep in mind about viruses is that the way that they, the way that they are seen, or the way that they manifest in different species, could be totally different. So for all a snake with a certain virus could react in ways that aren't sneezing, but the virus is still hijacking and affecting those cells in that snake. So a virus, actually, there are probably so many viruses that humans can have and other distant species can have. We just don't think about it because they don't exhibit those same symptoms that we might think of in terms of that disease, which is kind of interesting. And bat soup in the bat cave is a bad idea. You right. No more bat soup. Please, people, no more bat soup. Yes. And let's see, our group based on what animal biotransmitted them to humans. Right, exactly. And so also keep in mind that viruses, have so many different strains and versions of themselves. And so where something winds up working for them, could absolutely be group based. And then you have to look at things like vectors or general transmission. So in wildlife biology and in other fields biology as well, we talk about vectors as far as something that can carry a disease but not be themselves affected. Mosquitoes and malaria. Mosquitoes don't come down with malaria, right? But they do have it and carry it and transport it. So we also have to think about something like, is this a species that is being affected, or is this species just a vector? I will go ahead and take a moment to say that, speaking of these, transmission, and thinking of the other non-human animals in your life. So like my sweet baby Jane, she is a cat. It's looking like there is some evidence that this particular virus is transmissible and catchable through cats. Now, keep in mind, guys, research is constantly changing. There could be a paper published an hour from now that's like, no, those were all wrong. But for right now, it's looking like there is some transmission with felines. So, it's another thing to keep in mind, is that the behaviors that we all do, if we go out and engage in risky behavior, get too close to other people, go shopping when maybe we should have stayed home, we could bring something home and, maybe affect some of our companion babes. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, because these viruses are so rarely just a single species, because life on Earth is so similar to each other, on that genetic sequence scale, that a lot of things can be affected, and even if they aren't affected, they can still be carriers. Joe, I am not sure about canids. I've heard both cats, so felids, and then also I think some weasels or ferrets, which are like mustelids. I'm not sure, Joe, but that's the kind of thing to just keep an eye out, and, to not panic, but again, just engage in kind of, safe behaviors here, and keep in mind not just roommates or loved ones that are humans, but also your non-humans as well. And that goes for, a vector in terms of like spreading, just a spreader of disease. If there's an outdoor kitty that likes to come and get some scritches over here and then goes down a couple houses and gets some more scritches, some of those materials, mucus and other things that we have on our fingers could be in fur. It's just being smart, which sucks because I love petting outdoor kitties. So there you go, authoritative source here. Yeah, I think, everyone, Joe, is gonna deal with it and feel it a little bit different. So yeah, just a little bit more on pangolins. So this particular one I'm looking at. So here is a cool thing. The link that I sent you, you're gonna see has a ton of information. That's because the way that things get listed on the red list, it includes a lot of information. The big threats, and this is what part of what I study for my dissertation, the different threats and where we find them in certain species. So the biggest threats for this particular pangolin has a lot to do with humans. So both commercial development, residential development, so basically just housing in areas, and loss of habitat, which is the #1 driver of extinctions right now, but also biological resource use, so hunting and trapping. They are majorly threatened by hunting and poaching. Major. There's a demand in China and Vietnam, and the market's due for both live and dead animals. Basically, pangolin meat is kind of one of those high-end luxury products traded around, and they are, involved deeply in a lot of different trade routes, pretty much throughout Southeast Asia. So they are majorly threatened, and it's because of that. So critically endangered for the Sunda pangolin. So they're right there. The fact that this is an animal that's overexploited and traded, both live and dead, traded in markets with dense population and humans, that's a really good way to catch disease. Anytime we are placing another species into very tight quarters, like something like a meat market, that has consequences, right? Even if it's not just for the humans, I mean, it also can absolutely affect that species too. Let me see. Scotch Queen and Joe, both really good points. Let's talk about this. So Joe, yeah, this is a problem, right? These are not magic. These are not pharmaceutical. There's a lot of species that are traded in parts of the world where there are claims about it having some kind of, magical, medicinal, or healing property, but that's just not supported by the science. It's just not. And instead, what it does is it winds up leading many species to being endangered. So to follow up Scotch Queen, why not just stop the sale of bushmeat entirely? Okay, here's where we get into the nitty gritty of international conservation. Things that work well, maybe for you and I, and I'm not sure where you live, but where I live, I would be fine if bushmeat was completely stopped, right? I'd be fine. But there are groups of humans around the globe who rely on bushmeat as their primary source of nutrition, especially in Southeast Asia, and other places as well, where we see higher densities of these species, that these like smaller mammals that really get hit by bushmeat and hunting. But the thing is, we have to keep in mind that there are places that must do that to survive, or alternatively have it embedded within their culture to where it is kind of unchangeable piece. Now, culture and survival, you could argue, are two different things. If there's literally nothing else to eat, that's one thing. If it's part of your culture that you have to eat this thing because well, you know what? Maybe there's a conversation that needs to be had. maybe the younger generation, the Gen Z in that one group says, you know, actually, what if we didn't? What if we switched over to this, right? These are two different things. I think that cultures can evolve just like any other, you know, kind of creature on Earth, and that might happen. But long story short, why not stop the sale of bushmeat entirely? Because that is unfair to those on Earth who rely on it for survival. But there are ways to do it better, and that's where education and outreach comes in. There are absolutely ways to do things more sustainably. There are ways to avoid species that we know are majorly endangered. And those are the ways that we can, as educators and communicators, actually try to help. But culture winds up being a big part of it too, and certainly shouldn't be overlooked. So yeah, pangolins are so cool. It makes sense, you know. I mean, think about if you had humans gathered up to be used as, you know, meat or a resource for some other species. We were all really densely together. We'd probably totally catch like way more diseases than usual, just because of being packed in high densities. And then some of those diseases might be transmittable to whatever that other species is in this hypothetical that is, you know, corralling us. The point is, it's not like pangolins are just dirty and disease ridden. It's like everything on Earth has diseases. It's when we place them into, you know, close confines, and just don't know much about it, that, you know, disease can go up. Definitely density dependent. Oh yeah, Dorky Toomey. It says come to the shark side is definitely what this shirt is. Yes, it is absolutely something to do with sharks and Star Wars. You nailed it. That is correct. Oh man, yeah. So that's a little on that. So, right. Hey Chris, welcome. We're doing it at a little different time today because I wanted to make sure that some who haven't been able to join were able to join. Yeah, absolutely. Smallpox. Yep, you got it exactly. And Nostalgia Chew says fish farms. Yes. So there are actually studies about on the genomic level, on the gene level, that show adaptations to captivity. That then, if those captive bred, like fish, farmed fish, get out into the wild for some reason, and then they mate with a wild individual, their offspring can actually have detrimental. There can be detrimental effects, so harmful effects in those offspring because of the adaptations that are actually being demonstrated and evolving really quickly in those captive populations, which is really interesting. Hi, Brooke, welcome. So here's the thing that I wanted to hit on today. Now that we have, for those of you just now joining, we pulled up our sciencedaily.com. We looked a little bit at things that were trending in the literature. We're talking a little bit about pangolins, which are a species of mammal that are incredible. They're highly endangered, and they are likely one of the ways that COVID-19 has been able to transfer between bats and humans, though of course we're still learning all the time. I wanted to talk a little bit about expectations. This is my broad theme as I was thinking about today and about what I wanted to mention. There are a lot of things that got canceled or moved or changed in our lives due to COVID-19. For example, I was in the middle of a musical that then got canceled, even though we put in all that work. I had another performance that was supposed to happen last weekend, but a couple weeks ago it was canceled. You know, these kinds of meetings, a course I was going to teach this summer, a field course, you know, that's canceled. And I'm sure that you guys also in your own lives have things that have been canceled or moved due to this. I want to talk about, though, these things we expected, these things we expected to happen that aren't happening anymore, how some of those can actually affect life on Earth on the broad scale. Because 2020 was actually supposed to be this like super year for biodiversity. So now we're going to get in a little bit into international policy, and I'll let you guys in on a little bit of that. So 10 years ago, in 2010, there was a group calling for 2010 being the year of biodiversity, and a group, the Convention on Biological Diversity, unfortunately CBD. So now the CBD, instead of being that biodiversity convention, everybody's just like, oh yeah, pot. So that's unfortunate. But when you hear me say CBD today, I'm talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we had a bunch of countries sign on to this convention. That, you know, if you go up far enough, you get a run by, organized through, tangent to the United Nations. You have all these countries sign on and decide that they are going to put together some goals, this list of goals. And the idea is that countries who signed on to the CBD and were part of this, of which there are like close to 200 now, they set goals for themselves to reach by 2020. These goals were called the Aichi targets. And so these are the Aichi biodiversity targets from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And a little bit of background, and I'm just reading through a couple of policy briefs here. The Convention on Biological Diversity actually went into force at the very end of 1993. So this is something that's been along for a really long time. Currently has 196 signed on countries. Yeah, I knew it was close to 200. I just wasn't sure which one. And so there were a couple really big kind of like landmarks in CBD's history, a bunch of protocols, cross-cutting work programs, and things like that. But this, back in 2010, a strategic plan for biodiversity on Earth was put into effect. And the strategic plan was meant to be for the years 2011 to 2020. Well, it's 2020 now. So the entire world related to biodiversity, people working within that, were supposed to meet this year to see how we did. As you can probably guess, that meeting is very questionable right now. It's supposed to be in October, and we're kind of waiting to hear what's going on with that. And so this is this global biodiversity framework, and they set it in with these Aichi targets, and that named for the place where they set these targets. So I'm gonna link you these Aichi targets now, so that you can see what targets were put in place for biodiversity. That this year we were supposed to be able to check in on all of these. So we'll briefly just look at them, and they're arranged in 5 strategic goals. The first strategic goal, goal number A, is to just figure out and address the things causing biodiversity loss. And the way they wanted to do that was by mainstreaming the idea of and the value of biodiversity across government and society. So inside of this strategic goal, we have targets 1 through 4. Target 1, by 2020 at the latest, people are aware of the values of biodiversity and the steps they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. Keep in mind, the targets I'm reading you right now, every country, these 196 countries, are trying to do on the country level. And then what they do is they submit a national report saying how they've done. That's the goal, at least. So that's target number 1. Do people know about why biodiversity matters, and do they know the steps they can take to conserve it? Target number 2, by 2020 at the latest, biodiversity values have been integrated into national and local development and poverty reduction strategies and planning processes. So basically, we are taking those values of biodiversity, making sure they are mainstreamed within society, even within the idea of human poverty and government assistance. And target 3, by 2020 at the latest, incentives harmful to biodiversity are eliminated, phased out, or reformed. So the idea of, you know, being able to just pay your way out of environmental harm, or having these subsidies and things that wind up being harmful to biodiversity in the end, are eliminated. And then target 4, by 2020 at the latest, governments, business, and stakeholders at all levels have taken steps to achieve or have implemented plans for sustainable production and consumption, and have kept the impacts of use of natural resources well within safe ecological limits. Wow. Imagine that you are the person in charge of implementing these for your country. Obviously you would have a team and you would be gathering many, many people, but just imagine thinking through that wording and the idea that, we're keeping the impacts of natural resource use well within safe ecological limits. I mean, how do you even begin to start defining what a safe ecological limit is, right? It's very, very hard. So those were targets 1 through 4 of strategic goal A. All right. And if you're just joining, I'm talking about the Aichi 2020 targets that countries all signed on to, countries that are part of the CBD. They signed on, and the last decade was supposed to be trying to hit these targets. So now, strategic goal B, reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. All right. So targets 5 through 10 are inside of these. So target 5, by 2020, the rate of loss of all natural habitats is at least halved, and where feasible, brought close to 0. Wow. Yeah, no, we failed that one. Big time. And remember, these were made back in 2010. I totally, I hear you, Scotch Queen. Yeah. I mean, these are hard. I think there was a lot of optimism though, because people thought, we have an entire decade. We have a whole decade to do this. We can do this, but just didn't really work that way. So target 6, by 2020, all fish and invertebrate stocks and aquatic plants are managed and harvested sustainably, legally, and applying ecosystem-based approaches. So basically avoiding overfishing, which that has definitely not happened. Target 7, by 2020, areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, ensuring conservation of biodiversity. Some places have done better than others, for sure. And again, each country submits their national report saying how they did. So one country might submit theirs and say, target 7, we did it. We did great. And others might say, not so much. Target 8, by 2020, pollution, including from excess nutrients, has been brought to levels that are not detrimental to ecosystem function and biodiversity. Again, defining those levels, very difficult. But yeah, pollution is a major driver of extinctions. That hasn't happened. Here's a fun pop quiz for those in the chat here. Anyone know, when it talks about pollution from excess nutrients, what kind of nutrients are we typically thinking of? Who's got it? It's a pop quiz. Fertilizers? Yep. So what nutrients inside of fertilizers? Think like which specific elements? Yeah, nitrogen. Yep. And nitrogen and okay, good work, team nitrogen. Yes, nitrogen, and also phosphate. And if you were about to write phosphorus or phosphate in the chat and I missed you, I apologize. Yeah, good job. Yeah, so nitrogen and phosphorus are the big ones there, because they cause something called eutrophication, which is a major increase in nutrient availability. And what that does is it winds up creating things like algal blooms or major increases in certain species that then can kill out other species. It can lead to fish kills across coastal areas, all kinds of stuff. Yeah, I got you, Zachary, for sure. Yep. Hey, nice job, guys. Nice job. Laura's like, I'm on it. Jessica's on it. Yep. Nostalgia's on it. Yeah. So it's interesting that, target 8 is talking about pollution, including those things that are what we typically think of as like good stuff, right? Yeah. Yay, Joe K. Love you. So target 9. Remember, right now we're within the strategic goal B, which has to do with reducing those pressures and sustainable use. So target 9, by 2020, invasive alien species and pathways are identified and prioritized. Priority species are controlled or eradicated, and measures are in place to manage pathways to prevent their introduction. Now, if you know anything about me and invasive species, you'll know that this is a really complicated topic for me, and I have a lot of thoughts. One thought I will give is it's amazing that within these biodiversity life on Earth targets, the idea of eradicating species is a target. um, it's interesting and complicated. But yeah, so target 9 does have to do with invasive species and the idea of that management. So target 20, target 10, this one was earlier on. By 2015, pressures on coral reefs are minimized. Well, not so great in that department either. I think there was a major bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef like a week or so ago. And yeah, so not so much on that one. So we're halfway through the Aichi targets. Would anyone be interested in a brief sidebar about coral bleaching and what it means, ocean acidification? Like, I can give you a like super mini crash course on what is actually happening. Okay, cool. I see one yes. So I will do a brief sidebar. So the whole thing here is that we have to remember that the oceans are touching the air. I know that sounds like I'm just stoned and like rambling. The oceans, man, they're like touching the air. They are. The ocean is in direct connection, communication, like interaction with the air in the atmosphere. So molecules within the atmosphere are absorbed and sink and actually can get cycled with that top layer of ocean water, and then it can go deeper and all kinds of cool stuff. So when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, so CO2 in the air, go up as they are now, that means that there are more carbon molecules and oxygen, so C and O's, in the air than usual. Those molecules are then exchanged with and get filtered into ocean water. When that happens, carbon dioxide changes form into a different kind of carbon compound. And that carbon compound, that carbonate, is slightly acidic. So then all that carbon dioxide that was hanging out in the atmosphere is now in that layer of ocean water as that different carbonate form that's acidic. And so functionally, you have a higher acidity in that ocean water. So when people talk about ocean acidification related to climate change, it's like, how the hell do those go together? It has to do with carbon and the carbon cycle. So yeah, there's your quick sidebar for that. And then when you have higher acidity, that stresses corals. Corals have these amazing, remarkable little creatures called zooxanthellae that are these tiny organisms that they are actually on the corals. They give them that kind of color and some of that shape and form and texture. They get stressed, they get released from those coral, those polyps, and you are left with just bare blank coral. All their friends left. It's a bummer. I don't know if they're friends. I was anthropomorphizing it. For all I know, one zooxanthellae is like a mortal enemy of a coral polyp. Who's to say? The point is, they wind up leaving. Yeah. So Seth / Joe K, any kind of sea life that likes or has adapted to acidity. We have seen there have been genomic studies of coral reefs to see that there are certain corals that seem to have a gene for being resilient to higher temperatures and also higher acidity. So we know that corals themselves have capacity for evolution, that natural selection for these individuals with more resilient genes to these changes likely will persist, but it's totally a time game. How long will it take for that to happen? Corals take forever to grow. And those changes evolutionarily are typically more slow than what's happening with the changes to the earth. So hard to say. I think anytime you wonder if there's a species that does better, the answer is yes. It's just how many are doing better versus how many are doing worse, and then how do we prioritize that? And it becomes very tricky. Hopefully that kind of answered your question. All right, so thank you for the coral reef sidebar time. So if we check out now, we're in strategic goal C of these 20 Aichi targets for biodiversity to hit before 2020. So I'm in, it's target 11 through 13, all have to do with this goal number C. Oh boy, I told you I do not do well in the mornings. Letter C, which has to do with safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Whoa, genetic diversity, ooh la la. These targets are a part of, I'm in an international working group on these targets that have to do with the way countries report genetic diversity, which is really fascinating. So I know these a little bit more than the others. But target 11, by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved through like protected areas and area-based conservation measures. I don't know how well that's been hit globally. It's been hit by some countries. Some countries have achieved that and some have not. Zach, that's funny. Yeah, yep, that's very fair. Excellent physics add in there. Target 12, by 2020, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented. Bummer. And their conservation status has been improved and sustained. Yeah, no, have not done that. Things that we know are threatened have gone extinct. And on the whole, a lot of known threatened species have declined more than they have improved. Target 13, by 2020, the genetic diversity of, what do you think? It's not just of species on Earth. Check this out. By 2020, the genetic diversity of cultivated plants and farmed and domesticated animals and of their wild relatives, including socioeconomically and culturally valuable species, is maintained. So genetic diversity comes into the game, and it's really not about genetic diversity for life on Earth. It's about the gene stocks of like farmed and cultivated species. Some wild relatives, yes. So a big thing that this working group that I'm on, what we're trying to do is we are suggesting that this be expanded to include genetic diversity in general for just species on Earth, not having to do with like agriculture or just because something is socioeconomically important, but just genetic diversity itself. Nostalgia, is the vaquita gone? No, I don't believe so. It is definitely in trouble. Let me look up what they're looking like right now. Population. Yeah, I mean, there's a handful left. Some of these are kind of hard to make sure that these are correct, though. There are not that many. There's like a handful. There's a report due in early 2020. Save the Vaquita Day 2020 is supposed to be July 18th. I don't know. There's only a handful left. The Vaquita is in trouble for sure, but I don't know if it's gone. Yes, that's true, Scott Tweeton. That's definitely true. Joe, no, they haven't. In fact, they've not been hit. But it's just really interesting that genetic diversity comes in, and there's a bunch of people like me who have studied conservation genetics, and we're like, yay, people are talking about genetic diversity instead of just number of species. And then, you read the details and you're like, wait, it's just for like farming. Come on, we can do this. We can do better. We can expand this. All right. So now that was all for C. Were these seen as lofty goals when they were made? Absolutely. And that was the whole point. Similarly to climate change and guidelines set in place by international working groups like the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the goals they set are meant to be lofty but not impossible, because we want to push society and we want to take it seriously and say, big change needs to happen, but not to the extent that it's totally impossible. Now, as time has passed, and certainly right now as we're looking at this, some of these goals seem impossible, but keep in mind it's at the country level. And so the way that these things get implemented is that a country government has to say, you know, we're implementing this policy and we're doing this thing. Scotch Queen, you're right. There's a lot of genetic diversity work that is done with species within zoos, definitely. Though again, people then argue about, you know, if you're talking about the genetic diversity of a species as the whole, do you include captive bred species? Because does that really tell you about evolutionary potential? It's all complicated. But I will say one really cool way that zoos are implementing this is with Tasmanian devils. So Tassie devils have a type of cancer that's actually contagious. It's transmittable. And it's devil facial tumor disease. And so they have these cancerous lesions on their faces, but also their bodies that then can be spread. What some of the zoos are doing in Australia is they are doing genetic sequencing and mating those with better resilience to that disease to then help that entire species. So that's a great example of major zoos doing genetic diversity work with endangered species. Let's see, Chris. Yeah, I know. I know. Look, it's hard not to give up when you feel like major players are not doing their part. But here's what gives me hope is I think about the local level. So I think about the idea that the United States was pulled out of the Paris Accord. I say pulled out because on the whole, I think the United States wants to be in it. We were pulled out by an administration that does not prioritize it, and that's just a fact. Even though we were pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there were mayors and governors on the local level that said, you know what? We still want to try to hit this target, or we still want to do something. So we're going to implement laws on that local scale. So don't give up. Don't feel it's, you know, of course it's fine to feel overwhelmed. I feel overwhelmed by this stuff all the time, but just remember that a lot of change that really happens locally. So just keep that in mind. All right, so target 15 by 2020, ecosystem resilience and the contribution of biodiversity to carbon stocks has been enhanced. So this is restoration of at least 15% of degraded ecosystems, which has to do with mitigating some climate change and avoiding things turning into deserts, habitat turning into deserts. And then target 16, this is another one that had an earlier deadline. By 2015, this one, protocol on genetic resources, is in force and operational. And that one actually has done pretty well across the board. So now the last 4 targets of the Aichi 2020 biodiversity targets are all contained inside strategic goal E. Enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. Okay, so that sounds just like a lot of words. So let's look at the individual targets. Target 17, by 2015, each party, as in each country that signed on, each party has developed, adopted as policy, and implemented an updated national biodiversity action plan. So basically, by 2015, everyone, if you've signed on to this, you need to have an actual piece of policy and action plan in place. Most countries have done that. Let's see, target 18, by 2020, the traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity are respected. Not just respected, but that they are subject to national legislation and relevant international obligations and integrated within the implementation of this convention. So basically, we want to respect and involve indigenous and local communities, but it needs to be under the umbrella of regulation and implementation at the national level. So target 19, by 2020, knowledge, the science based and technologies relating to biodiversity, its values, functioning, status, and trends, consequences are involved. widely shared and applied. So target 19 is the stuff that I try to do with science communication and others. So basically we're just trying to tell people about it, that people understand what's happening. We are widely sharing and transferring and applying information. And target 20, the last one, by 2020 at the latest, the mobilization of financial resources, finally money comes into the picture, financial resources for putting this in action should increase, as in by 2020 at the latest, we need more money to implement this kind of stuff. Fair enough. So these are the Aichi biodiversity targets, named Aichi because that was the city that this meeting was in where they agreed upon this. So why am I bringing this up today? Why am I bringing this up in terms of COVID-19? Because expectations of things we thought we were going to get to do now in May, this summer, maybe even fall, are being wrecked. The meeting that was supposed to happen in October for the entire United Nations to meet after it's been 10 years and to say, okay, how did we do? What's the next step? This meeting is possibly going to be moved, canceled, rescheduled, affected, absolutely affected in some way. And so Aichi Prefecture. I don't. What is a prefecture of Japan? I'm so sorry. I don't know. I do not know much about the Japanese town, city, county, state equivalents. Prefecture is, I'm guessing, is like a region. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yes, a prefectural government official site, like a state. Okay, awesome. Thank you guys. I appreciate that. So yeah, that's where the meeting was, roughly, and they named it that. So yeah, the goal was to, everybody to meet, and it was going to be, this meeting was supposed to then to be in place to establish our post 2020 game plan. So like the idea that not only is the meeting, the convention of parties, potentially not going to happen for the UN for this biodiversity, massive group, but the fact that like the planning stages for the next bits are disrupted, is really hard to deal with, because there are people that have been working on these and countries that have been working on these for 10 years and checking in and going along the way and communicating about it and updating policy and meeting, 196 countries planning to come together to talk about non-humans. And right now, for a good reason, we are thinking and talking about humans, because we are looking at our own species right now and worried about our own species, which again, for a good reason, that this matters. Human lives matter. Like, there's a reason why we're focused on that. But it's just kind of a bummer that we have this expectation as a conservation, a body of conservationists, right? Just conservationists across the country. We had this expectation of 2020 being this like super year of biodiversity, of the Aichi targets. It's been since 2011. We're checking in our goals and we're making our framework and our policy for the next steps. So it is hard that that's being disrupted. So when you are thinking of things in your own life, expectations you had for things that were going to happen that maybe have been shattered or changed, keep in mind that there are other species on Earth that depend on human gathering. Like the fact that humans gather all together at a convention of parties at the UN to discuss biodiversity goals, that gathering of humans that we can't do right now affects other species. Now, are the people involved with the UN and the CBD adapting and changing and figuring something out? Totally. Yes, totally. It's not like it's just gone. I'm just saying that this whole thing has made me think about the idea that the ability for humans to gather and talk and make ideas and collaborate as a social species impacts so many things on Earth. And these 2020 targets that now, who knows when we're going to get to talk about them and check that out. It's a great example of that. And it's just kind of interesting to me, and a humbling thought when I think about the things in my personal life that got disrupted. There are things on a bigger scale that are disrupted as well, but there are ways to evolve and adapt, and I have no doubt that those are going to happen. Yeah, Chris, that's totally the case. Yeah. Definitely other species, non-human species, are enjoying a little bit of their downtime without as many people outside. That's true. Reminds us, right? Like, seeing different species outside at different times now is a great reminder of us being just a part of the system, right? Like, we are a part of the system. Our presence or absence affects other species directly, not just because, I went hunting and I affected that species by, killing it. No, just affecting a species by being present is like really interesting, right? So yeah, definitely pretty cool. Babe Jane, hi. Do you really need to take a bath, or would you rather just maybe come cuddle me on my lap? That'd be great. Thank you. Much to the chagrin of my HOA. That's hilarious. Oh, what are they gonna say about it? They can only send an email. That's fine. Yeah. So those are some things. Any questions or thoughts on the idea of this Convention on Biological Diversity, the 2020 Aichi targets, international frameworks? Any questions? Go ahead and put in the comments, and I'm happy to try my best. There's a tiny lag, so it'll just be a couple of seconds. I'll be able to read some stuff. Okay, Arya. The answer is no. Most countries have not met most of the 2020 targets. And Scotch Queen, I think they are meeting virtually right now. Like, I can tell you, my group that just looks at the Target 13, the genetic diversity one, have a meeting in like 2 days online. And these have been happening. Let me pull up a country just to show you guys an example of a national report. So ones that they give in, you know what, we're just gonna say Scotland. I think did they submit? Let me think. Let's say I'll just do Germany. Germany CBD national report. And I'll the reason I'm pulling one up is to just tell you how many targets like one country was able to do. There's a target regarding countries setting policies and plans in each country by 2015. Did the U.S. meet the target originally? Hey, fun fact: the United States is not part of the CBD, and that angers me to a very, very large degree. The United States is not one of the 196 countries signed on to this thing. So, Pollyanna, I cannot answer that question as far as the U.S. meeting that target, because the U.S. doesn't actually go for those targets. And okay, so I'm looking at Germany's right now. I'm looking at like a part 3. I'm gonna put that. Oh, of course Canada is. They're just angels. Of course they are. I'm not bitter. So I just linked you guys a doc for, this was the 5th national report. Right now we're on the 6th, but this was submitted in 2014 by Germany, the 5th. And if you go to part 3, on page 111, you can see that those are the progress towards the 2020 IHG biodiversity targets, if you're interested. So for those of you like me who are American, here's something to keep in mind. No, we are not signed on to the CBD, and no, we do not do these individual UN targets. However, the United States has an incredible framework and setup for endangered species and environmental protection within our own country. I don't like the fact that we do it on our own, but that said, we do a good job on our own, at least in terms of species. We don't do great in terms of environmental protection, in terms of climate change regulations, but in terms of individual species and listings, we have a really robust framework in place. It is not perfect, and there are totally problems. But just because the US is not signed on to the CBD doesn't mean that the United States does not participate in the protection of biodiversity. So just so you know, that's, I mean, I think that really does matter. Let's see, Zachary, what does it mean that so many targets were failed? I think so. It's like, did we just put these targets up to, try our best and push, and we just assume we'd fail? Or, is this like sad? Again, it really depends on the country. Individual countries, I think, are going to come out of this really having done a good job. Others are going to come out of this being like, yeah, that did not go well. But either way, we've learned something. Those countries have learned the places where they can try to do better, and they can then talk to other countries who have been able to implement changes and see what can happen there. These targets are just words on paper. They're just words on a screen. The things that are happening, actions locally every day by people, are what's actually going to change things. And I think that sometimes the kind of benchmarks we put sometimes don't reflect actual life on Earth, like we saw with the target 13 about genetic diversity. That doesn't have to do with genetic diversity of life on Earth. That has to do with genetic diversity of things related to humans. So even within this huge international framework, there's room for improvement in terms of what we're valuing and prioritizing. So I don't think it's like a sad that there's failure, because at the start there was definitely room for improvement in some of the goals. But having goals in place, as any of it, helps drive momentum, right? It pushes that forward momentum. Yeah, exactly, Scotch Queen, exactly. Like, just, yep, being alive, learning about the life around you, learning about impacts, is the best thing that you can do, is being informed and staying rational and keeping an open mind to the way that knowledge changes over time. We had a thought that, organic farming is really, really good, so let's do that. But, new evidence is showing that organic farming has a higher carbon and global warming impact. So, there's trade-offs. Nothing we do in terms of action is perfect. There are pros and cons to everything. And vote. Yeah, totally. And vote, because again, these laws are not like these Aichi targets and all these goals and things. They don't matter unless a country with legal authority implements policy. That is how change really happens at the international level, is on the national level. And change on the national level totally does have to do with voting, and depends on where you live, of course, but being involved in that decision making is great. Is very, very great. Oh wow, how did we already do an hour? That's amazing. I was going to also read a tiny bit of Leopold for you guys, if that sounded good. But if people would rather talk about this for a little bit, that's fine too. Again, if you're joining, this is just a little check-in with our International Nature League here together. Yes, Marley. Okay, cool. I'll read some Leopold. Dorgatumi, yes, I actually know about Swedish wolf situation. Yes, inbreeding is a problem for biodiversity. Inbreeding typically happens when populations have been reduced and are smaller and have lost habitat. All those things are totally connected. So yes, inbreeding definitely has severe effects for population persistence. Totally. Cool. So, bam. This is, for those of you who aren't sure, a Sand County Almanac and sketches here and there by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold died in 1948, but he wrote these, and then these sketches were published after he'd passed away. He was just an absolutely incredible pioneer of wildlife conservation and management in the United States, and was also just a beautiful writer, I think. And so there's so many passages to share, but I think I'm going to share this chunk on wilderness. So it's a couple of pages. Sorry, a couple means two. It's like 10 pages. So I'm just going to read. And this is Leopold specifically talking about the idea of wilderness, which I think is really interesting to think about in terms of 2020 versus him thinking about wilderness, almost 100 years ago. I challenge you to think about things that maybe have changed or things that have stayed the same. And my God, the opening sentence alone is just so good. Oh, Leo. Oh, Leo. All right. So here is Aldo Leopold on wilderness. Wilderness is the raw material out of which man has hammered the artifact called civilization. Wilderness was never a homogeneous raw material. It was very diverse, and the resulting artifacts are very diverse. These differences in the end product are known as cultures. The rich diversity of the world's cultures reflects a corresponding diversity in the wilds that gave them birth. For the first time in the history of the human species, two changes are now impending. One is the exhaustion of wilderness in the more habitable portions of the globe. The other is the worldwide hybridization of cultures through modern transport and industrialization. Neither can be prevented and perhaps should not be, but the question arises whether, by some slight amelioration of the impending changes, certain values can be preserved that would otherwise be lost. To the laborer and the sweat of his labor, the raw stuff on his anvil is an adversary to be conquered. So was wilderness an adversary to the pioneer. But to the laborer in repose, able for the moment to cast a philosophical eye on his world, that same raw stuff is something to be loved and cherished because it gives definition and meaning to his life. This is a plea for the preservation of some tag-ends of wilderness as museum pieces for the edification of those who may one day wish to see, feel, or study the origins of their cultural inheritance. The remnants. Many of the diverse wildernesses out of which we have hammered America are already gone. Hence, in any practical program, the unit areas to be preserved must vary greatly in size and in degree of wildness. No living man will see again the long grass prairie, where a sea of prairie flowers lapped at the stirrups of the pioneer. We shall do well to find a 40 here and there on which the prairie plants can be kept alive as species. There were 100 such plants, many of exceptional beauty. Most of them are quite unknown to those who have inherited their domain. But the short grass prairie, where Cabeza de Vaca saw the horizon under the bellies of the buffalo, is still extant in a few spots of 10,000 acre size, albeit severely chewed up by the sheep, cattle, and dry farmers. If the 49ers are worth commemorating on the walls of state capitals, is not the scene of their mighty hegira worth commemorating in several national prairie reservations? Of the coastal prairie, there is one block in Florida and one in Texas, but oil wells, onion fields, and citrus groves are closing in, armed to the teeth with drills and bulldozers. It is last call. No living man will see again the virgin pineries of the lake states or the flatwoods of the coastal plain or the giant hardwoods. Of these, samples of a few acres each will have to suffice. But there are still several blocks of maple hemlock of 1,000-acre size. There are similar blocks of Appalachian hardwoods, of southern hardwood swamp, of cypress swamp, and of Adirondack spruce. Few of these tag-ins are secure from prospective cuttings, and fewer still from prospective tourist roads. One of the fastest shrinking categories of wilderness is coastlines. Cottages and tourist roads have all but annihilated wild coasts on both oceans, and Lake Superior is now losing the last large remnant of wild shoreline on the Great Lakes. No single kind of wilderness is more intimately interwoven into history, and none nearer the point of complete disappearance. In all of North America east of the Rockies, there is only one large area formally reserved as a wilderness, the Quetico Superior International Park in Minnesota and Ontario. This magnificent block of canoe country, a mosaic of lakes and rivers, lies mostly in Canada and can be about as large as Canada chooses to make it, but its integrity is threatened by two recent developments: the growth of fishing resorts served by pontoon-equipped airplanes, and a jurisdictional dispute whether the Minnesota end of the area shall be all national forest or partly state forest. The whole region is in danger of power impoundments, and this regrettable cleavage among proponents of wilderness may end in giving over power the whip hand. In the Rocky Mountain states, a score of areas in the national forest, varying in size from 100,000 to 500,000 acres, are withdrawn as wilderness, enclosed to roads, hotels, and other inimical uses. In the national parks, the same principle is recognized, but no specific boundaries are delimited. Collectively, these federal areas are the backbone of the wilderness program, but they are not so secure as the paper record might lead one to believe. Local pressures for new tourist roads knock off a chip here and a slab there. There's perennial pressure for extensions of roads for forest fire control, and these by slow degrees, like public highways. Idle CCC camps presented a widespread temptation to build new and often needless roads. Lumber shortages during the war gave the impetus of military necessity to many road extensions, legitimate and otherwise. At the present moment, ski towns and ski hotels are being promoted in many mountain areas, often without regard to their prior designation as wilderness. One of the most insidious invasions of wilderness is via predator control. It works thus. Wolves and lions are cleaned out of a wilderness area in the interest of big game management. The big game herds, usually deer or elk, then increase to the point of overbrowsing the range. Hunters must then be encouraged to harvest the surplus, but modern hunters refuse to operate far from a car. Hence, a road must be built to provide access to the surplus game. Again and again, wilderness areas have been split by this process, but it still continues. The Rocky Mountain system of wilderness areas covers a wide gamut of forest types, from the juniper breaks of the southwest to the illimitable woods where rolls the Oregon. It is lacking, however, in desert areas, probably because of that underage brand of aesthetics which limits the definition of scenery to lakes and pine trees. In Canada and Alaska, there are still large expanses of virgin country. A representative series of these areas can and should be kept. Many are of negligible or negative value for economic use. It will be contended, of course, that no deliberate planning to this end is necessary, that adequate areas will survive anyhow. All recent history belies so comforting an assumption. Even if wild spots do survive, what of their fauna? The woodland caribou, the several races of mountain sheep, the pure form of woods buffalo, the barren ground grizzly, the freshwater seals, and the whales are even now threatened. Of what use are wild areas destitute of their distinctive faunas? The recently organized Arctic Institute has embarked on the industrialization of the Arctic wastes, with excellent chances of enough success to ruin them as wilderness. It is last call even in the far north. To what extent Canada and Alaska will be able to see and grasp their opportunities is anybody's guess. Pioneers usually scoff at any effort to perpetuate pioneering. The next section is wilderness for recreation. Physical combat for the means of sustenance was, for unnumbered centuries, an economic fact. When it disappeared as such, a sound instinct led us to preserve it in the form of athletic sports and games. Physical combat between men and beasts was, in like manner, an economic fact, now preserved as hunting and fishing for sport. Public wilderness areas are, first of all, a means of perpetuating in sport form the more virile and primitive skills in pioneering travel and subsistence. Some of these skills are of generalized distribution. The details have been adapted to the American scene, but the skill is worldwide. Hunting, fishing, and foot travel by pack are examples. Two of them, however, are as American as a hickory tree. They've been copied elsewhere, but they were developed to their full perfection only on this continent. One of these is canoe travel, and the other is travel by pack train. Both are shrinking rapidly. Your Hudson Bay Indian now has a putt-putt, and your mountaineer a ford. If I had to make a living by canoe or pack horse, I should likely do likewise, for both are grueling labor. But we who seek wilderness travel for sport are foiled when we are forced to compete with mechanized substitutes. It is footless to execute a portage to the tune of motor launches or to turn out your belly mare in the pasture of a summer hotel. It is better to stay home. Wilderness areas are, first of all, a series of sanctuaries for the primitive acts or arts of wilderness travel, especially canoeing and packing. I suppose some will wish to debate whether it is important to keep these primitive arts alive. I shall not debate it. Either you know it in your bones, or you are very, very old. European hunting and fishing are largely devoid of the thing that wilderness areas might be the means of preserving in this country. Europeans do not camp, cook, or do their own work in the woods if they can avoid doing so. Work chores are delegated to beaters and servants, and a hunt carries the atmosphere of a picnic rather than of pioneering. The test of skill is confined largely to the actual taking of game or fish. Okay, keep in mind this was written in like 1920, 30, so almost 100 years ago. There are those who decry wilderness sports as undemocratic because the recreational carrying capacity of a wilderness is small, as compared with a golf links or a tourist camp. The basic error in such argument is that it implies the philosophy of mass production to what is intended to counteract mass production. The value of recreation is not a matter of ciphers. Recreation is valuable in proportion to the intensity of its experiences and the degree to which it differs from and contrasts with everyday life. By these criteria, mechanized outings are at best a milk and water affair. Mechanized recreation already has seized 9/10 of the woods and mountains. A decent respect for minorities should dedicate the other 10th to wilderness. The next section is wilderness for science. So that one was wilderness for recreation. Here's wilderness for science. The most important characteristic of an organism is that capacity for internal self-renewal known as health. I love that definition of health, by the way. I'm going to read it again because I like it so much. The most important characteristic of an organism is that capacity for internal self-renewal known as health. There are two organisms whose processes of self-renewal have been subjected to human interference and control. One of these is man himself, medicine and public health. The other is land, agriculture and conservation. The effort to control the health of land has not been very successful. It is now generally understood that when soil loses fertility or washes away faster than it forms, and when water systems exhibit abnormal floods and shortages, the land is sick. Other derangements are known as facts, but they are not yet thought of as symptoms of land sickness. The disappearance of plants and animal species without visible cause, despite efforts to protect them, and the eruption of others as pests, despite efforts to control them, must, in the absence of simpler explanations, be regarded as symptoms of sickness in the land organism. Both are occurring too frequently to be dismissed as normal evolutionary events. The status of thought on these ailments of the land is reflected in the fact that our treatments for them are still prevailingly local. Hey, talked about that. Thus, when a soil loses fertility, we pour on fertilizer, or at best alter its tame flora and fauna, without considering the fact that its wild flora and fauna, which built the soil to begin with, may likewise be important to its maintenance. It was recently discovered, for example, that good tobacco crops depend, for some unknown reason, on the preconditioning of the soil by wild ragweed. It does not occur to us that such unexpected chains of dependency may have wide prevalence in nature. When prairie dogs, ground squirrels, or mice increase to pest levels, we poison them. But we do not look beyond the animal to find the cause of the eruption. We assume that animal troubles must have animal causes. The latest scientific evidence points to derangement of the plant community as the real seat of rodent eruptions, but few explorations of this clue are being made. Many forest plantations are producing 1-log or 2-log trees on soil which originally grew 3-log and 4-log trees. Why? Thinking foresters know that the cause probably lies not in the tree, but in the microflora of the soil, and that it may take more years to restore the soil flora than it took to destroy it. Many conservation treatments are obviously superficial. Flood control dams have no relation to the cause of floods. Check dams and terraces do not touch the cause of erosion. Refuges and hatcheries to maintain the supply of game and fish do not explain why the supply fails to maintain itself. In general, the trend of the evidence indicates that in land, just as in the human body, The symptoms may lie in one organ and the cause in another. The practices we now call conservation are, to a large extent, local alleviations of biotic pain. They are necessary, but they must not be confused with cures. The art of land doctoring is being practiced with vigor, but the science of land health is yet to be born. A science of land health needs, first of all, a base datum of normality, a picture of how healthy land maintains itself as an organism. We have two available norms. One is found where land physiology remains largely normal despite centuries of human occupation. I know of only one such place, northeastern Europe. It is not likely that we shall fail to study it. The other and most perfect norm is wilderness. Paleontology offers abundant evidence that wilderness maintained itself for immensely long periods, that its component species were rarely lost, neither did they get out of hand, that weather and water built soil is faster than it was carried away. Wilderness, then, assumes unexpected importance as a laboratory for the study of land health. One cannot study the physiology of Montana and the Amazon. Each biotic province needs its own wilderness for comparative studies of used and unused land. It is, of course, too late to salvage more than a lopsided system of wilderness study areas, and most of these remnants are far too small to retain their normality in all respects. Even the national parks, which run up to 1 million acres each in size, have not been large enough to retain their natural predators or to exclude animal diseases carried by livestock. Thus, Yellowstone has lost its wolves and cougars, with the result that elk are ruining the flora, particularly on the winter range. At the same time, the grizzly bear and the mountain sheep are shrinking, the latter by reason of disease. While even the largest wilderness areas become partially deranged, it required only a few wild acres of Weaver to discover why the prairie flora is more drought resistant than the agronomic flora which has supplemented it. Weaver found that the prairie species practice teamwork underground by distributing their root systems to cover all levels, whereas the species comprising the agricultural rotation overdraw one level and neglect another, thus building up cumulative deficits. An important agronomic principle emerged from these researches. Again, it required only a few wild acres for Tegrediak to discover why pines on old fields never achieve the size or wind firmness of pines on uncleared forest soils. In the latter case, the roots follow old root channels and thus strike deeper. In short, all available wild areas, large or small, are likely to have value as norms for land science. Recreation is not their only or even their principal utility. Okay, so that's wilderness for recreation, wilderness for science, and now wilderness for wildlife. The national parks do not suffice as a means of perpetuating the larger carnivores. Witness the precarious status of the grizzly bear and the fact that the park system is already wolfless. Neither do they suffice for mountain sheep. Most sheep herds are shrinking. Again, this is over 100 years ago. Wolves are now in Yellowstone National Park, but he's right that there were a lot of predator relocations. The reasons for this are clear in some cases and obscure in others. The parks are certainly too small for such a far-ranging species as the wolf. Many animal species, for reasons unknown, do not seem to thrive as detached islands of population. The most feasible way to enlarge the area available for wilderness fauna is for the wilder parts of the national forests, which usually surround national parks, to function as parks in respect of threatened species. That they've not so functioned is tragically illustrated in the case of the grizzly bear. In 1909, when I first saw the West, there were grizzlies in every major mountain mass, but you could travel for months without meeting a conservation officer. Today, there is some kind of conservation officer behind every bush, yet as wildlife bureaus grow, our most magnificent mammal retreats steadily toward the Canadian border. Of the 6,000 grizzlies officially reported as remaining in areas owned by the United States, 5,000 are in Alaska. Only 5 states have any at all. There seems to be a tacit assumption that if grizzlies survive in Canada and Alaska, that's good enough. It is not good enough for me. The Alaskan bears are a distinct species. Relegating grizzlies to Alaska is about like relegating happiness to heaven. One may never get there. Oh, brutal. Saving the grizzly requires a series of large areas from which roads and livestock are excluded, or in which livestock damage is compensated. Buying out scattered livestock ranches is the only way to create such areas, but despite large authority to buy and exchange lands, the conservation bureaus have accomplished virtually nothing toward this end. The Forest Service has, I am told, established one grizzly range in Montana, but I know of a mountain range in Utah in which the Forest Service actually promoted a sheep industry, despite the fact that it harbored the sole remnant of grizzlies in that state. Permanent grizzly ranges and permanent wilderness areas are, of course, two names for one problem. Enthusiasm about either requires a long view of conservation and a historical perspective. Only those able to see the pageant of evolution can be expected to value its theater, the wilderness, or its outstanding achievement, the grizzly. I'm going to read that line again. I love it. Only those able to see the pageant of evolution can be expected to value its theater, the wilderness, or its outstanding achievement, the grizzly. But if education really educates, there will in time be more and more citizens who understand that relics of the Old West add meaning and value to the new. Youth yet unborn will pull up the Missouri with Lewis and Clark, or climb the Sierras with James Cap'n Adams, and each generation in turn will ask, "Where is the big white bear?" It will be a sorry answer to say he went under while conservationists weren't looking. And then the very last section, defenders of wilderness. Wilderness is a resource which can sink but not grow. Wilderness is a resource which can shrink but not grow. Invasions can be arrested or modified in a manner to keep an area usable either for recreation or for science or for wildlife, but the creation of new wilderness in the full sense of the word is impossible. It follows then that any wilderness program is a rear guard action through which retreats are reduced to a minimum. The Wilderness Society in America was organized in 1935 for the one purpose of saving the wilderness remnants in America. It does not suffice, however, to have such a society. Unless there be wilderness-minded men scattered through all the conservation bureaus, the society may never learn of new invasions until the time for action is past. Furthermore, a militant minority of wilderness-minded citizens must be on watch throughout the nation and available for action in a pinch. In Europe, where wilderness has now retreated to the Carpathians and Siberia, every thinking conservationist bemoans its loss. Even in Britain, which has less room for land luxuries than almost any other civilized country, there's a vigorous, if belated, movement for saving a few small spots of semi-wild land. Ability to see the cultural value of wilderness boils down, in the last analysis, to a question of intellectual humility. The shallow-minded modern who has lost his rootage in the land assumes that he has already discovered what is important. It is such who prate of empires, political or economic, that will last 1,000 years. It is only the scholar who appreciates that all history consists of successive excursions from a single starting point, to which man returns again and again to organize yet another search for a durable scale of values. It is only the scholar who understands why the raw wilderness gives definition and meaning to the human enterprise. So that last line, it is only the scholar who understands why the raw wilderness gives definition and meaning to the human enterprise. So that is just a chunk on wilderness within, a Sam County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. Apologies for any, scripts of pronunciation, etc. I've actually never read this aloud. I've read it so many times myself, but it's interesting to hear it out loud. Zach, that's hilarious. Duh, Mars, build new wilderness. But that's a really interesting question, right? Like if a human tries to create wilderness, and wilderness is typically thought of as places where humans are not, then a human could never create wilderness. It's just kind of a loop, right? Cool. Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm glad. Some of these things, like I said, I would challenge you to ask yourself what things you heard in that have changed and which things are still the same. Obviously, he's writing from a perspective as an American, in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. Mentioned some bits of Europe, but I think in general, the idea philosophically of the way that wilderness can be used by humans and what it means and the evolutionary perspective, I think is really great and holds up. Yeah, just totally fascinating. So just a little something for you guys. Let's see. A lot of people still have issues with this. Oh, well, Scotch Queen, we can actually talk about on the next time we do this live stream. We can talk about reintroduction of predators. I have a presentation that a guy named Mike Mitchell, Dr. Mike Mitchell, was actually he's at the University of Montana and works with the wildlife co-op here for the state. He was part of the wolf reintroduction team for Yellowstone, and I always have him come and present for my class, and I still have his one of his like PowerPoint presentations. So that's totally a topic that is something we could chat about. Anyways, but it is 12:34 my time. I am going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you all for joining me. The live streams will always be available on the Nature League site. If you haven't seen it yet, we made a new Nature League video, which is awesome and pretty fun. I sent Adrian out on a scavenger hunt. And yeah, we'll think about the next live stream. Until then, stay safe, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and hang in there, and we'll get through it together, but together far apart. It's a way together. That's the good stuff. Obviously, I'll end by showing you Sweet Baby Jane, because all right. And she's just the littlest ball baby. She's been here the whole time. Hey, baby girl. Yeah. You say bye. Bye, guys. Take care.